Hello, everybody. Bo Billington with the Free Agent Podcast. Today, I've got a very special guest, Yvonne Jackson. Yvonne, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today we're gonna tackle a topic: diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DE&I. And Yvonne's a resident expert here, and super happy to have you on.
Thank you. No, this is something I am very passionate about. So
Yeah.
getting the opportunity to just share this information with other people, this is who I am.
Yeah, and so you recently left corporate America to go out on
Yes.
your own and start a consultancy based around DE&I initiatives and helping SMBs to small medium businesses to really kind of maybe stand up a presence and a
hmm
focus in the DE&I space. Is that correct?
Yeah. So for the last 4 years, I've been working at Apple, which I'm sure most people know, have heard of them. And for the last few years, while there, I was working in diversity and equity space, not just in their employee research group, but also as a DEI expert. So I worked with a division of 15,000 people, ensuring that they could put together a strategy, right? That worked for them, and not just a strategy, but like how do we create standardization and operations? Because that's where people kind of hiccup. They know they want more diversity,
Sure.
they make a great commitment statement, but how do we actually turn it into tangible results? So I felt there was a need to do that more in different companies of different sizes, so I decided to go out on my own with Social Edge.
That's awesome. So what's going to be your focus? I mean, is there a specific vertical industry? Is it size companies, or is it, any organization that wants to kind of, put together a better DE&I footprint?
Yeah, of course, every consultant says everybody, right? But I do have a sweet spot for tech companies. I've been working inside engineering companies since I was 17 years old and was an AutoCAD designer. So I know the ins and out of the different personalities, workflows. I also have a project management background. So I kind of treat DEI like that. Like there's strategy, there's metrics, there's all these things
Sure.
that we do to ensure, our output is correct. But in general, what I'm looking for are companies that have already shown a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion by naming what we call executive sponsor, right? And they've already started maybe some type of DE&I committee or council. And I'm not saying that they have figured it all out and they have it all working, but those two things, having an executive sponsor and having some type of council made up of volunteers, that kind of shows that they're ready to go, right? There's something in that company that wants to do better. And those are the people that I really love working with.
Versus just stating, "Hey, we've got a focus of DE&I," and that's kind of the press release, and that's all you hear. But they actually
Yes.
get put skin in the game. That makes
hmm
sense. So I think it's a good segue for the people who are listening. So can you give us an outline, or or define what DE&I actually is in 2023?
Right. So specifically, DE&I stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what a lot of people forget is that this is really talking about belonging. We all, when we come into the workplace, we want to feel like our thoughts are cared for, we're valued. We want to be able to make maybe not friends, but associates that we can laugh with, have a good time with, right, while we work. And so a lot of what I focused on is the E in that equation, equity. And the reason why I focus on that is because sometimes people say that diversity inclusion work is all about equality, but equal access doesn't always mean equal playing field. So when people say that they're creating a DEI function or ID&E, there's all the different ways you can put the letters. What
Mhm.
they're really saying is that they acknowledge that in our history, discrimination has occurred, right? And that selection process has not always been in favor of those with the same equal personalities, skill traits, and so forth. So what we're doing is trying to, level that playing field so that it's not just about achieving merit, because typically most people in these roles do have that merit. They just may not be in a position to have sponsors or mentors to help them get them there. So that's what I look at it is everything at the end of the day comes to an equity outcome. And that equity outcome helps everybody.
That makes sense. And so how would you say that the DE&I has changed over the last 5 years? So 2023 now, I feel like this has become kind of more of a buzzword in the last 3, 4, 5 years or so.
Yes.
Much more bigger focus in the most recent years. But how has that kind of changed? And where do we find ourselves in 2023?
I think a lot has changed. Some things have stayed the same, and that's why I do this work. But Previously, when people thought about training, all they thought was one-off, courses,
Mhm.
unconscious bias training, allyship, how to get along. And actually, for my company, Social Edge, I don't offer those things because what I see is that it's more about the full picture and just one-off courses. That's not going to change people's behaviors. It might inform them, but it's not going to take them to the level that, again, we see tangible results. So that's one of the ways there's been a shift with DE and I practitioners is not just doing one-off trainings, but let's look at the full picture. The other is this reliance on employee research groups, which have different names depending on what company you're at.
Mhm.
And typically these are volunteers that have raised their hand and say, hey, I want to do more events around maybe like this month, Black African American month, right? Heritage Month, and other things like that, Pride Month. Or they see that there's some issues at work around diversity and they want to just raise their hand to help. In the past, leadership has basically just handed it off to these groups without extra recognition, without extra pay, nothing, right? And what does that lead to? It leads to burnout. So what people are recognizing is that we can't rely on ERGs. Instead, leadership plays a huge role, right? My thing is, if you want me to come in and help coach your ERG or your council, I need someone in leadership in the same room, right? Because if they're not there, how are they leading by example, right?
Sure, I
That's
agree.
where we get that real shift. And I think the third thing that has changed, which my background originally was digital marketing, and I saw this happen, is the role of data,
Mhm.
right? Once marketers used to just go by their gut instincts, then suddenly like data analytics happened and they decided, oh, wait, we can decide and be informed by data. And the same thing is happening inside the diversity field. You can actually come up with KPIs. You can up with metrics to measure quantitative and qualitative. The thing is that it requires transparency. And
Sure.
that's what scares people, right? So a lot of what I teach inclusive leaders and groups is, hey, these are the things we can measure so that after 1, 2, 3 years, you can actually measure and understand what the impact of all those initiatives had on your company. And all that's going to do is get people more excited to keep going, right?
That's awesome. So if I had to kind of distill this down, I mean, so basically it's, getting the leaders involved, which it's funny how that's not just a theme on the DE and I space, it's across the board,
Yes.
transformation, anything that's going on within a company,
Mhm.
the leadership's not involved. It's not going to happen. Holistic training as well versus, one-off courses. And that makes sense too. So it's got to be a complete mind shift
Right.
and
Yeah.
across the company starting at the top, kind of trickling down. And then finally leveraging data. And I think that's a great point as well, because that does lead to transparency, which gives people a baseline. And it may be uncomfortable, but then also to your point, you can track it over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then show actual real results. So I think that's some sage advice for those that are looking. One quick question: you mentioned ERG. What does ERG stand for?
It stands for employee research groups, and there's different ways. Like at Apple, I was part of Black at Apple, which you can kind of infer that that's for African American or those from the Black diaspora. So any group that's focused on a specific maybe group of people, underrepresented, or maybe a religion or something like that, they typically come together in organizations to kind of create a council of so forth. They provide feedback for leadership, right? They help host events, but like I said, sometimes all of the work is put on their hands. And these individuals typically don't have power, right?
Mm.
They're not at the top of the leadership hierarchy. So we have to provide them with support, right? And the resources to get things done if we are going to use them in our companies.
So I think that's a good segue into the next question, which is what can companies do tomorrow to start focusing on DE and I? And obviously, again, you mentioned 3 points a second ago, which were really interesting about getting the leadership involved. But above and beyond that, maybe let's get kind of one layer deeper. Like, what can a company really do who's like, hey, we're not really diverse, and what can we do to kind of create a better footprint moving forward?
Yeah, so to kind of go back and talk about the data informing us on what to do, that's good business, right? We create strategies based upon the data we have, what we know, and that's how we inform what we're going to do. So one of the first things that I advise companies to do is to do an audit. And sometimes I get pushback because they're like, well, we're not doing that much. So what is there to audit? Well, there is things to do. In fact, there's several areas which people can audit. They can audit either the people of the diversity of the people in their organization. They can make look at their marketing. What does who's being shown in their marketing, if that's what their business is, where's representation it looks like. There's other places like, are you looking at retention and retainment? When you do exit interviews, are you asking the right questions to understand why people are leaving? There's all these things in which people can measure, but no one wants to do that initial audit. And what I will typically do is come in and I actually have a list of like a blueprint of how this works and what to do. And the reason why I push for the audit and assessment is so that people can have an honest look at themselves.
Yeah.
This is where we are right now. It's not to shame and blame, but if we're going to measure and be able to understand the impact later on, we have to have a baseline, right? And then we also need to prioritize. Do we need to do all 10, 12 things on the list, right? Especially for those who have already started down this journey, that assessment is about, are those things really moving the needle? Are they about diversity and inclusion, or are they focused more on team engagement? That's where I sometimes see things shifting, things thrown into the DEI bucket when they should be more in learning and development, right? So that's what I believe is the first step, is an honest assessment of audit of your maturity level as a company. And then at that point, you can start making informed decisions and you can start prioritizing what you can do for the next 3 months, 6 months, year.
Yeah, I totally agree with the audit, and it's no different from like the consulting space. If you don't have a baseline, then what are you even going to get, like, excuse me, consult on? And we do the same thing in our business. Like, we have to have a discovery session. If there's not a discovery session, then we literally don't know what to work on and don't know what to prioritize.
Right.
You're essentially kind of shooting in the dark. So it's strange that there'd be pushback, but I guess it probably would be a bit difficult for a lot of business owners and CEOs to really kind of take a look inside and say, okay, maybe we're deficient, because, you know, if you don't measure it,
Yes.
then it doesn't exist. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So that's pretty interesting. Well, fast forward a little bit. So a company's got, you know, a DE&I focus. You know, what could they do to really kind of put together a sustainable program in the future? Is it hiring somebody like yourself? Is it finding consultancies? Is it bringing somebody internally? Is it a combination thereof, depending on how large they are? Like, what's a good practice for a company that's got a focus and they want to create kind of a sustainable program that they can track, measure, of course, going back to the analytics and the leaders involved and the holistic training?
Yeah, well, there's different areas. You know, typically when a company decides, hey, we want to focus on diversity and inclusion, they go out and you see it right now. There's a job description on LinkedIn or somewhere saying with a list of 20,000 different things they want to see in a diversity coach or chief diversity officer. But one of the things that I've been explaining, and you see a lot of practitioners saying, is at the start, ask yourself, do you need someone full time?
Right.
Because there are times where I know I've interviewed for roles, and what I found is that that list they have of what's needed isn't accurate, right? And what they think they need from someone coming in a role doesn't match up. So when someone is hired, they're not set up for success because they were told something in the interview process, but when they get into the job, what they realize is that no one really knows what they're doing. So one of the things, and the reason why I went into this role and as an entrepreneur and as a businesswoman is because I feel like there's a space and time where a person like me can come in as either a fractional leader or a intern coach that sets up the foundation for what DEI looks like, right? We already have that audit done. We already have done the assessment. We've already done feedback and gathered information from the people in the organization. We already have the things that they've done put into pillars, like, hey, we want to focus on development. We want to focus on hiring. We want to focus on engagement. We kind of like put those things in place already, so that when someone new starts in this role, they can just go, right?
Yeah.
Versus spending the first 6 months to a year trying to get company buy-in, which I've seen happen, right? You can spend a year as a new DEI professional in an organization just getting buy-in. So that's one of the things I think we could shift in is how can we get companies to be more prepared to
Right.
bring on these individuals? And that's something that I'm doing because I know what it's like to be burnt out. I know what it's like to coming into these roles. I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for. So
Sure.
how can I help companies get there so that other individuals, when they're hired, they don't have to go through that beginning phase?
Well, this makes a tremendous amount of sense. And it's kind of similar to what we do as well, where we work with like high growth companies that they want to stand up an initiative or they have a hypothesis they want to try to kind of suss out. But they don't necessarily have the means to afford somebody to do it full time, or maybe it's not a fully baked job description because they're not sure what they're going to do. And so we'll bring in, fractional executives as well that can kind of like help stand up the strategy. The practitioners, so they're plug and play. They know exactly what needs to be done. But also, too, more importantly, I think, is that they're an independent like observer and independent counsel. And so they don't have a vested interest in politics, and they really can come in and give a real like holistic view of like, here's what's going on. But then additionally too, what I always tell consultants is like your job should be to work yourself out of a job.
Yes.
Especially in a fractional interim capacity. So come in, maybe it's 3, 6, 9 months, whatever that timeline is. But ultimately you can create and establish the program, but then help find your successor. And chances are, instead of somebody who's like this executive, you can actually go downstream a little bit and find maybe a less experienced resource who's not going to fail, to your point. They're not going to be set up for failure. And I think that's what a lot of companies do as well, is they want to go a little bit cheaper on a lot of roles, and they bring in an experienced resource who's it's just not going to work out because they don't have a construct. So I think that's super interesting. And I think you've carved out a phenomenal niche. One follow-up question I have for you, though, you mentioned at the outset of the call about diversity fatigue. What the heck is diversity fatigue? Does that tie back to kind of like coming into an organization and not having buy-in, not having KPIs, not having transparency, not having the leaders, or is it something else entirely?
It's all of those things. So I know I had to find a word for what I was feeling like. I need to tell I'm passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion, making sure everyone feels like they belong. But at times I get super tired and exhausted. And there were times where I just wanted to walk away. And I'm like, what is this feeling I had? So when I did research, I came across this phrase that has been used in business for a while called diversity fatigue. And what it is it's a feeling of exhaustion, isolation, frustration, and it sometimes manifests as skepticism because you've been spending so much time driving equity and trying to build this culture of inclusion. But maybe you're doing it at a time where everyone's frustrated because layoffs are happening. There's these outside factors. Or maybe the organization is all talk and not walk, right? So here you are inside trying to do all the things, but no one's listening to you. What's going to happen? You're going to get exhausted. And that's what's called diversity fatigue. But there's also a flip side to it. Not everyone in a company believes that diversity and inclusion needs to be a top priority. So when they hear nonstop, we have a new diversity course, we have to do this, they get exhausted, right? Because they're like, oh my God, here it comes again. Sure. But again, what that usually comes from is the fact that the company has said they are committed, but they don't actually have a process in place for doing it, and they haven't communicated to everyone how it gets done. If you can figure out how to communicate what you want done with realistic goals and within a time frame that makes sense, right? And if you can start to celebrate those little wins, people feel much better about it. They feel like, okay, I contributed last month and I can now see there's some change, right? But when we expect too much from everyone at work, when we don't empower them to make change, all that's going to happen is diversity fatigue, and nothing good comes from that. And there's all types of fatigue in the workplace, as you know, and that's not where we want our employees to be.
So a couple of things. First and foremost, you should trademark that if it's not trademarked already.
I am not the person who came in, but I will definitely preach it to the mouth.
Maybe that's yours, but no, that makes sense. And it's funny that all this always seems to tie back to the leadership and not having buy-in. And I understand why somebody would be fatigued on both sides of the coin, because there's not clear guidance, there's not clear transparency, but then also too the KPIs. I think to your point you made
Yeah.
earlier that maybe somebody who didn't buy into it, but then all of a sudden now they're seeing data, they're seeing that they're helping. I could see how that could get somebody who's not on
Yeah.
the bus, and then also now trying to contribute to the overall program. But again, it ties back to the leaders, and if the leaders aren't involved, then it sounds like you're dead from go.
I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion is just good business, right? There, and I'm not even going to sit here and talk about all the studies and surveys that's proven it. It just is, especially for companies that their products and services are found in communities that are represented that look differently than the employees, right? How
Sure.
are you going to create services and products for individuals who don't even exist in your company, right? It's good at business, and it's also just I don't know. I don't know about you. Good karma.
Yeah.
It's about being a good person, right? It doesn't always have to be this power struggle that if we support one group, another group gets something taken away. Again, it's not, what do they call it? A zero sum game. It
Right.
really is all about belonging and inclusion, and it benefits everyone.
That's interesting though about kind of the zero sum game and the perception that if you're going to give more attention to this group, then this group's going to suffer, et cetera. That's super interesting. And again, I think a lot of that could be stopped with education, and again, having your leaders come on board and say, hey, we're behind this, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But actual, like, having actions that tie back,
Right.
this
And
initiative.
and I have like the smallest I don't know, metaphor story to kind of describe it. It's something that someone told me in a course around diversity and inclusion. And it's this concept of an aquarium. There's people out there who love their fish, right? They have aquariums, there are millions of fish in there. So there's let's say one man, he goes to a shop and he says, hey, I typically work with these fish, but I want to add some different flavor, different colors, different type of diversity to my aquarium. Can you offer me some different fish to put in there? And the owner of the pet shop says yes, but just understand that if you take on a more diverse ecosystem of fish, there's some changes you're going to make. Maybe better water quality, oxygen levels, type of food. There's a lot more work comes into it when you want an ecosystem that's more diverse. And the person says, you know what, I really want this. I love, this is my passion. So he does exactly what the pet shop owner says. He upgrades the ecosystem, he upgrades the water, he does all these things. And what happens? The new fish thrive, and all the fish, all the creatures in the ecosystem, all the plants, they all thrive too. So again, it's not about, oh, we focus on building someone up, everyone else is going to get less. No, everyone actually gets more. And that's the philosophy that I'm trying to teach people, that it's not about giving up power. It's about all of us, again, being able to feel like we belong, we're valued, and we're able to build products that create a better world.
I think it's awesome, and that's a great place to end. And it makes sense to me too, getting everybody on the same, sheet of music, working together versus folks in their different silos doing their own things, not worried about what the left hand or the right hand's doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's awesome. Love the analogy, your metaphor. I really appreciate you having you on. So where can people find you, Yvonne?
Yeah, you can find me. My website is www.socialedg. There's no E on the end.com.
Put a link to it.
Right. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Yvonne Jackson, YVONNE. And everyone can find me at Yvonne at socialedg.com as well. But I've really enjoyed my time though as well. This has been awesome.
Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. We'll be sure to add your link to the podcast. And this was awesome. Really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
All right.